Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to get started today with our live briefing, Economic Statecraft and International Coordination, brought to you by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. My name is Madeline Field. I'll be your moderator today. I'm an assistant editor at War on the Rocks, where I work on our Cognitive War vertical, which focuses on defense tech and industrial policy. So this is the fourth in our live briefing series, assessing the economic statecraft problem set as a core national security domain. And these webinars are based on our ongoing 11 parts article series in War on the Rocks titled War by Other Ledgers. So today we'll be discussing how finance has emerged as the central instrument of economic statecraft and how to more effectively leverage it. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Georgie Skipper, co-founder and CEO at the Lucedia Group and a visiting scholar at MIT, and Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow at the Potomac Institute. Georgie, Tim, thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So to our audience, as usual, Georgie and Tim will be doing a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so feel free to put your questions in the chat. And this will also be uploaded on YouTube later, so you can also watch it then. So we're going to jump right in because we have a ton of questions. So Georgie, I wanted to get started just by looking at your article. You start it off with a very strong thesis, including the second sentence, which says, the ability to mobilize and direct large pools of public and private capital across critical industries, defense, infrastructure, manufacturing, and technology is becoming the defining instrument of contemporary economic statecraft. So what makes this thesis true at this point in history? Why not ever in the past?
Yeah, thanks so much, Maddie. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think as part of that central thesis, I also put forward this kind of idea of there being three layers of economic statecraft: finance, physical assets, and the technology and innovation that sits across those physical assets and is enabled by them. And I think we're really starting to see that come to the fore in the context of critical industries. And this is a particularly important moment in time right now because we've got speed and scale, and we're operating in a really different structure of the modern economy. Previously in World War II and even in the Cold War, governments would look at particular assets and be able to mobilize them and fund them. So the US government would sort of decide, okay, right, we need tanks and ships, and we'll mobilize those in times of war. And that ability to command the production and the financing capacity gave coordination naturally. But now a lot of those critical industries are sitting in private sector balance sheets, are controlled by actually more of the private sector financing and also even private sector capability. So the difference is really extraordinary. And really what has happened is that now there's much more of the complexity upstream. And a big part of that, a huge part of that, is actually around the issue of actually the critical infrastructure assets and inputs that build these things. So, cables, ships, ports, critical minerals, all of these things that actually go into the input of building and creating and enabling the supply chain are all enabled by the private sector. So that's been a massive, massive change that we've seen. And then, of course, the other change that we've seen as well is that there's been a huge uptick in the actual capital capacity and need and the quantum of capital that's needed to actually provide money into those things. And so when you consider the scale of the demand and then also the scale of the capital required, that's fundamentally changed the landscape of economic statecraft for all nations, and particularly adversaries are starting to catch on to this, right? So this is a major, major issue. So that kind of fundamental shift is seen. Now we saw that, for example, even in research and development. DARPA sat within the US government, right? And now a lot of that technology and innovation sits within the private sector. Same too with infrastructure. Infrastructure is, essentially needs to have a return. It needs to be able to be invested to actually leverage that private sector capability. So across critical technologies, across critical infrastructure, all those different areas, we're seeing this really natural big shift happen. And I think that's, informing this kind of new contemporary economic statecraft.
And so when you talk those three layers, that finance, physical infrastructure, tech, most of the conversations have been focused on tech, right? So why do you think that is up until this point?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually, because it's almost like if you look backwards, tech, infrastructure, finance. We started with tech. I think the critical moment in time was when especially Five Eyes nations, saw that the Chinese had created 5G technology. That was a really, really big wake-up call. And the tech and innovations of side of that realization meant an acceleration to look at how do we rechange and recalibrate. And then, from there we've seen, and the article kind of covers actually a lot of venture capital and a lot of finance vehicles that have tried to mobilize around tech. We've got the development of a lot of like technology innovation ecosystems, really looking at how do you create that capability within nations. And then on the other side, and the next stage, I suppose, is then the infrastructure piece. And we've seen that already too, Belt and Road and other kind of equivalents. Finance is almost like the obvious thing that was kind of forgotten. But I think we're seeing a huge uptick in now that realization. And in effect, it's had to be the last because it has to respond to what markets need and what actually the commercial sector requires and where the customers are.
So let's dive into that a little bit then. So you lay out, the different investment vehicles that are available to industry. You cite four private and public capital sources, so venture capital, development finance institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and then pension systems. So can you tell me a little bit more about sort of the costs and benefits of each of, this parts of the capital stack, starting with venture capital?
Yeah, I think the fundamental part that, and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this as well, Tim, but I think the fundamental part of what has happened really recently is the establishment of a whole range of different investment vehicles that are effectively a mixture of fully government funded, partly government funded, quasi-government supported, ones that draw on government prioritization but are fully private sector funded and private sector mobilized. And then within that, then you've actually got a range of different organizations that are purely venture capital, mobilized through development finance, private equity, and others. So this article actually sits on a body of research to really look at like a lot of the establishment and didn't have enough words to kind of cover the number of examples of these different organizations. But I think, the hallmarks, the really kind of key ones here is the UK establishing NSIF in 2018. Then you've got obviously the development of the Office of Strategic Capital, a huge enabler of US primacy over innovation and critical industries. Even recently, we've seen the announcement of the Australian fund that will actually co-partner with a fund to invest into technologies to support the needs in Australia's defence sector. And then probably the hallmark or the benchmark, particularly at a multilateral sovereign level, is the NATO Innovation Fund. Actually mobilizing large amounts of capital over across most of the NATO countries and then reinvesting that capital to support the innovation ecosystems of NATO countries. And that's directed and being led by NATO critical technology priorities, but obviously sits independently and has its own independent investment committee. So those particular examples, most of those focus on like sort of the role of venture capital and quasi private sector and public sector funding. But then if you actually kind of look at the whole critical, the whole capital stack, obviously there's different roles for different parts of the finance system. So VC, DFIs, and of course private equity, debt, and pension funds. And they all play different roles. So this is why I think a lot of people focus on this idea of the stack, like where there's the bedrock is obviously where you can use government funding to de-risk and you go from there. So one of the really key parts, and I think this is a crucial element of what US allies and partners are looking at the moment, is this kind of idea of taking how do we extend what we've learned from venture capital and dual use technologies and technologies into critical infrastructure, critical assets that require billions and billions and billions of dollars to actually establish. What are the transferable kind of principles that we can look at that? And the interesting part there, just in the context of mentioning pension funds, is that there are large amounts and pools of capital that actually sit in geographies, for example, Australia, Japan, obviously a lot in the Middle East, that we can draw on from those different areas.
So
I think
Yeah.
that We have the what's great about all the vehicles that you just mentioned, right? A lot of those are they're new, right? They're it's an approach maybe that haven't been taken before between governments and industry, and I think maybe we haven't seen the end of that innovation, right, in this space,
Yeah.
because of just because of the nature of the environment that we're dealing with and the risk associated. So,
Mm,
what I'm excited to learn and see, right, is that evolution. So what does that evolution look like? What are those relationships? What is that vehicle that we haven't thought about yet that we might be seeing come to fruition as we move forward? And then just to revert back really quick on the last question, just very quickly, we're hyper connected in a way that we never have been in human history. Like we really are, right? I mean, digital, finance, is the fact that you could pick up a phone anywhere in the globe and transact. You can buy a house. You can be in sub-Saharan Africa and you can buy a house like in North America, right? So the ubiquity and availability of information and the speed at which it moves and being able to exploit that, I think that that dynamic.
mm,
Really, weighs into the calculus on how this is going to evolve moving forward. And I think we're just starting to kind of figure out what that's going to look like.
yeah.
So it's pretty exciting. Yeah, especially with dynamic markets like we have, right?
Yeah. I just want
Yeah,
bounce
of
one
course.
one
Yeah.
thing off. I think the other thing about the evolution of these vehicles, just to go back to that first
Yeah,
point, is this kind of idea of like what can they learn from each other?
totally.
Because they're also happening in friends and allies geographies, a lot of them. And so the learning and the kind of like it's just as much about the ability to control or to influence capital, but actually the key part of that is actually like the coordination and the architecture, like the decision-making principles about why I'm making an investment, like why that's helpful and suitable. What's actually kind of to learn from that investment process. Because we're dealing with some really unknown territory. And that unknown territory is like how do I make something commercial when I don't know if I have a customer? Or how do I actually make sure that I know if I build this manufacturing facility that it's not just operational for 5 years, that it's operational for 20, 30, 40 years. So these sorts of things I think are like this is only just the beginning to your point,
Sure.
Tim.
Well, and where's the information coming from to make a risk decision there, right? You
Mm,
know what I'm saying? What are boards and CEOs like? What do they think? How are they thinking about this dynamic differently, in a way that they haven't before because of, the geopolitical, geoeconomic nature of things? I mean that it's gonna keep evolving, right? And some things are just not gonna work out, right? But yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned to your point. There moving forward.
yeah.
So we're touching on a bunch of different things. Friends and allies being one of the most important parts of your piece and something that we've already started talking about now. And so, as you guys have said, we've seen a development of these tools. They're becoming more and more, we're seeing them more and more. Why hasn't there been as sustained in Friends and Allies effort when it comes to finance? I know we have the NATO Innovation Fund, but that's fairly recent. So what has been a barrier to sort of progress in this area in the past?
Hmm. I think in a way this is like kind of a newer issue, a newer problem. And so we haven't had to solve it until recently in terms of like how we coordinate in this really networked way.
Mhm.
And so I think that's kind of like the first answer, but that's probably the easy option, the easy way out. The other components are obviously incredibly complex that relate to trade-offs between countries. And I think we're actually starting to see this even further in what the US administration has been doing to actually cut deals and to look at like sort of particularly I think in the critical mineral sector and even pack silica, this kind of idea of how do you coordinate across allies. So, I think what we need to bear in mind is that most of the time in the last probably like 10 to 15 years, something has been bubbling where there's been a kind of understanding and appreciation of the need to coordinate not just finance, but a variety of different other things.
Yeah.
And to the credit of successive US administrations, those efforts have been really well made in various different forms. The issue is that they've been initiatives based. And so they have a political life cycle that usually kind of ends at some point in time. What's very difficult for the private sector in particular is when you're dealing with long lead times of investments and when you're making critical business decisions, you have to make those decisions in an environment where you know that decision will be still relevant and profitable in a 5, 7, 10 year time frame or further. So I think that kind of dynamic alludes to the fact that we've had some really good bedrock initiatives that have actually been developing. We're seeing some come through now, but they tend to kind of disappear.
Mhm.
So I think the question in a way is, how do you institutionalize coordination that withstands political cycles?
Yeah, I think just within our government here, we're trying to figure that piece out, let alone with allies, partners, across the world too. And, so what are the best tools, vehicles, entities, just to talk to ourselves, let alone the rest of the world. But it's an imperative at this point, right? To your thesis for the paper, right? Figuring this out. So I think you're going to probably see new entities. I think it's an entrepreneurial opportunity, right? From the government side and from the private sector side, right? Because if you're able to thrive, in this world of unknowns that we're kind of delving into in a lot of ways, and the volatility of it, you're able to thrive in that, you're going to have a leg up, right? And so those entrepreneurial, those with that are able to thrive in that environment, I think are going to do well. What that looks like,
Makers.
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, right. Especially, yes, given how dynamic it's been lately, this last 12 months, especially.
So I'm curious if you guys had to pick, one barrier or one large risk to future allied coordination on something like this, what would you pick? What should, CEOs, what should people in the US government and the Australian government, whatever it is, what should we all bear in mind as we move forward?
I think speed of decision making is probably the biggest barrier, but I say that cautiously because obviously it's incredibly important to do the right due diligence. But I do think that we risk actually not making kind of critical decisions and not backing and not being taking enough. And I actually think that there's an interesting dynamic to observe in the kind of sub-layer of policy development where if you look at some of the initiatives over successive governments that have looked to try and support this, I sort of draw on the Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, for example, as a reference point when we were in government. I was in the Australian government when we were developing this, best efforts to actually coordinate capital and priority projects across our three nations of the US, Australia, and Japan. Um, that being said, the actual ability for the export credit agencies to align on their own mandates, that took a lot of time. And that's not necessarily like a criticism about that particular thing. It was just a function of the way that governments kind of like responding to different developments. So I think somehow if we can give political cover to policymakers and that not just to come up with these things, but then to like execute on them, to implement, to deliver, to show tangible progress. And like that's the kind of like key part that will be either the enabler or actually the challenge. And part of the challenge is also, in that kind of like the three layers of finance, physical infrastructure, and technology. The technology will move too quickly, or is moving very quickly in terms of its capacity and technological development, that new things will start to come up. And therefore, we're going to start to see new demands on physical infrastructure. And then we're going to start to see new financing structures or financing needs. And so somehow we have to act quickly enough to kind of get ahead a little bit further more quickly. of these things to kind of put us in the right place to start really kind of leading with confidence as opposed to feeling, I think, a little bit like we're playing catch up occasionally.
And Tim, I want to come back to you on this question, but I do have a follow-up question. I'm sure, part of the reason why people move slower is because of political risk. No one wants to make a bad investment, or a very risky investment because no one wants, 1,000 constituents calling in and saying, where are my tax dollars going? Whatever it is. So how do you think that, governments can better communicate this risk or sell it to people, to make them feel the urgency, understand that sometimes risk has to be taken, even if it ends up being a bad investment.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the Honolulu Defense Forum and I was actually incredibly impressed with the urgency and pace that was conveyed by various folks from US administration represented there, from Department of Defense and State, DFC and others. And I think that I think that this is kind of well known. And perhaps it's now about kind of moving beyond like de-risking at a political level to just being really forthright with communicating what it is that government thinks it needs
Mm.
and being explicit about that, because that will actually then help the private sector come in where it needs to. I think we've kind of passed a point now of potentially like the normal political risk that we see, should a government put in X hundred million in this or 200 million in this, that's actually kind of starting to happen. But the factor is can that enable private sector quickly enough?
Mm.
And the key element there is like communication. And communicating needs is sometimes like really easy, but sometimes it's really, really complex. And so, is there a translation that's kind of needed? Is there a, hey, we think we need this, or is there actually kind of like, going to procurement standards, like just best practice in procurement, I think is a really, or like supplier, sort of supply chains. These are really informative ways of just being quite straightforward about that element. But yeah, it's a random idea.
Well, Tim, that was great. Tim, any thoughts about what a huge risk would be?
So I'm going to double down on what Georgie said about communication because over our research and the community that we've talked to and this ecosystem and all that kind of stuff, this keeps coming up, right? There's not enough, especially from the government side. I mean, and that's nothing new, right? But how, where is that central source, right? Where's the clearinghouse on some of these things where industry can go and say, okay, I've got some confidence that maybe I didn't have, previously, because I know that this entity or this, this individual or this office, right? They're kind of the go-to when they're thinking about risk and adversarial capital, adversarial economics, and all that kind of stuff. They're the referee, right? Maybe for the government side, so they can speak with authority, when it comes to consistency on message, so you can make good decisions on the private sector side. Again, that demand signal, that is a constant issue that's brought up and the folks that we work with on this front. And so I think establishing, to your point, that line of communication with consistency that's just hasn't been there, is not there. I think it's a good starting point to help with, because that you're going to make other risk calculus based on what the signals you're getting. So I think you got to start there first, before move on to other things.
Yeah, I mean, communication has been like the total through line, I think, of all these webinars
Right.
that we've done. So I think things like this are great and people start talking about it and thinking about it. And yeah, that's why your article is very helpful. But I do want to pivot quick to AI infrastructure, which you lay out right away as an example of something that's very resource intensive, an emerging technology. It's very capital intensive, resource intensive. But we ran an article about this a couple weeks ago. It's been very difficult to actually set up coordination between allies, like especially in AUKUS. I know, I think AI is critical to Pillar 2, but the US has not engaged in, the sharing of resources that it would require. So what are some of the first steps that allies can take to start, communicating, coordinating on these critical industries?
Hmm. I mean, AUKUS is a really interesting reference point because I actually think it kind of highlights a little bit of the tension here on the thesis, which is obviously pillar one, is very much focused on the development of nuclear submarines, and that relates very much to this kind of like the physical assets. Like, how do I build those? How do I, as the US, make sure I have enough to be able to sell to others? What's the cost? What's that innovation?
Yeah.
How do I leverage the UK's capability in this?
Mhm.
That has been complex, and for good reason, because actually, you cannot sell something unless you know you have it for your own people. So that highlights, first of all, like that kind of tension and trade-off of what do I need to keep versus give away, a kind of classic economic conundrum. I think then in terms of like the AI infrastructure boom and looking at that, I kind of reference this because I believe it is possibly the kind of key forcing mechanism that may be the biggest kind of change, I guess, from an industry that we might see that could catapult like coordination and requirements. Because the reality is that, everyone in different industries really requires this technological innovation, whether it's, really quite straightforward, like provision of services, to really high-end dual use capability in terms of technology, and sort of like just innovation capability for allies and partners. So the forcing mechanism there, I think, is particularly interesting. At the bedrock of all of that is just energy provision. And I think, that used to be something that we were saying that was new many years ago. It's now kind of like a fundamentally really well-known piece,
Yeah.
and everyone's talking about it like too much. But energy provision is absolutely essential. But here's the thing. I think that energy provision in a lot of different markets is the key part of this because we're not going to be able to, reap the rewards of the AI infrastructure boom within the US allies and partners without understanding that obviously the entire AI infrastructure supply chain sits across so many different countries, across so many different financial vehicles. So funding those things, building those things, really requires like that kind of like, multilateral analysis. Pax Silica is and even a recent announcement, I think, since the article was published on this
Mhm.
fund, and this consortium fund, fantastic. The next phase then, though, is to actually start to make critical decisions around what is required in each economy to enable the elements. So for example, Malaysia, there's a large amount of data centers that are being built, a lot of manufacturing happening in Southeast Asia. Similarly to, Indo-Pacific markets have a phenomenal amount of energy and energy provision. And so what can you kind of build and create there, particularly with the need for data centers, not just to be housed in the US, also in like other allies and friends markets. So I think starting with energy is that's a kind of fundamental bedrock, and that really, in my mind, looks is around solar, wind, like anything that's renewable, because it's now just cheap. Like that's the reason to do that. And because it's mobile, you can build a solar farm anywhere. You can do this sort of stuff. And then nuclear, I think, is the other key component of that.
And what do you think is next after AI? Like, what is another, emerging tech area that is just ripe for coordination? Tim, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this too.
I think no, it's a great question. And to just touch on the last on the AI aspect of things, the security that goes along with that. We're seeing what's happening in the Middle East right now, right? And there's data centers there that have been at risk, right? And so, what does that mean for resilience and our ability to, to carry on moving forward? But I think one of the bio is just an amazing thing that keeps on that we're just starting to understand like what opportunities are, in the biotech world. Really, I mean, we as long as humanity's been around, we still don't understand the human body like in so many ways, right? But we've also made leaps and bounds, right? And who knows what AI is going to unlock
Mm.
for us there too. I, and I, to me, that's, and when specifically like with cognition, right? How do humans interact with digital,
Mm.
right? Moving forward, what does that mean from a psychology standpoint? What does that mean for the use and manipulation of information, right? We're seeing, those kinds of issues come up. So to me, that the cognition combined with AI, with what we don't know about still, at the cellular level or beyond, to me
Yeah.
is fascinating.
Yeah, I've heard tons about biodata, being an emerging asset that allied
Right.
countries can cooperate on. But
Mm.
Georgie, what do you think?
I don't think that the kind of critical industries kind of broad definition changes. And the reason why I use that in the article is like that's what JP Morgan actually came out and badged its, kind of very large scale investment. And I thought that was really informative because it kind of covers all of your technologies, all of your, actually recognition of energy infrastructure, other essentially anything that enables nations or groups of nations to have an advantage to continue to grow economically and to protect their nations and their citizens. So I still think that for example, bio kind of almost sits in that critical industries piece. I think, yeah, there'll be natural shifts between, where the emphasis is at the moment. The emphasis needs to be on physical infrastructure to support sort of the AI. I think the other kind of part of the question there is almost like, what does AI enable after? So, like on a bio piece, like everything stems from that. Yeah. And I think that's possibly the difference between, if you actually look back, I think the only other reference point recently for this potential kind of like shift of the financial landscape is basically, climate change, green energy. That, whether you see that or not, whether that's a priority or not, that did create a huge change in the financial landscape. We obviously saw the development of like ESG, like principles around sort of impact investing, making sure that things have that environment, social governance kind of components. And and a lot of the way that, obviously investors consider things that ended up just becoming normal nomenclature in everything. So I think that's a good reference point. But what it didn't do is it didn't change the kind of fundamental landscape of like what humans need and how we're going to innovate and develop. And so I think we've kind of reached that really interesting point now.
That is really interesting. That's a really good take. Shifting again. So a large part of your article focuses on these pension funds, which we've already discussed. But the US does not have a large, state-run pension fund. More modest capabilities that are still growing. OSC is, an incredible development there. But a smaller fund, certainly than other, Japan, I think you said has the largest, right? So why do you think that is, and what lessons can the US learn from its allies when it's, setting up larger funds like this?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other article, right? Like what that it's extraordinary when you look at the list of countries that have these pension funds. Canada, Norway, Australia, Japan. We see a lot in the Middle East. Like, hold on, how does that all work? So I'm not sure I can tackle that, that fully, to be honest. But obviously, I think different nations sort of start to realize that there is wealth creation that can be provided and providing certainty to individuals and to citizens in a longer term sense and creating those structures has been really important. I mean, as you know, for in Australia, that was a really, really fundamental economic change that happened a few decades ago, a legacy piece that I think is probably one of the most significant policies that was created, the kind of what we call the superannuation scheme. So that, that creation is really out of a time and place. Of course, in Australia, we saw, sort of this wealth creation, obviously, from a lot of our assets, our natural resources. And the same sort of has happened in Norway. But I don't think that this is a weakness in the US because the depth of the US private markets is like the strongest in the world. And this is what's like, it's really exciting to think about that,
Yeah.
just the sheer volume of capability and private sector capital. So it's just about like how that's kind of mobilized and used.
Mhm.
And that there's been discussions of do we create sort of our own sovereign wealth fund? Do we do those sorts of things? I think these are really valid questions. But at the same time, there's kind of this other piece, which is you've got the great bedrocks. Now, just like actually this coordination function is important. But the critical piece here, and any of my friends from the investment landscape would be saying to me, like, it's just all about markets, Georgie. Like ultimately, the markets decide. So you can't really tell a private allocator to invest in something when there isn't a return. So effectively, really government's role is just to kind of continue to ensure that bedrock of what it can control
Mm.
and take it from there.
So, and Tim, do you want to add anything there?
No,
Please do,
yeah,
because
well, I just don't know if that's something culturally, that we've grappled with, right? Until recently. And maybe we have, maybe I'm just ignorant of where we've been historically on that. But I think maybe culturally, just based on what you were just talking about, right? The incredible wealth and capital that is and where's the congruence there, right? And it'd be interesting to see actually what the decision points were in other close allied nations. Like what was a switch that said we're going to make this decision? What were the factors that led into that? Because I think maybe, especially with our closest allies and partners, that's probably where you'd look to the dynamics of that situation to maybe see if it would happen here, if it were to happen here,
yeah.
right? I don't know.
I think that would be a very, very pertinent point. And obviously in Japan, I mean, that's even a more established pension fund scheme that, almost invests literally in 100-year kind of
Yeah.
like
Incredible.
horizons. It's incredible. And so having that like time and ability to see, it's amazing. But to the point of like, how did these things get created and how do we use them and mobilize them? I mean, this is a really important consideration. We have $2.5 trillion of assets worth under management with the Australian pension funds.
Mhm.
And they traditionally invest in like low risk, but obviously they have a range of different investment opportunities. And there's a live conversation about, what is it that they should be investing in the context of directly supporting national or allies, US friends and partners capabilities.
Mhm.
And how do you do that? Because ultimately, like this is mums and dads, pension
Right.
money that
Return versus security.
yeah,
It's real.
it's
Yeah.
real.
Yep.
It's real.
Yep.
I think possibly another model that's really worthy of looking at further is Singapore's Temasek, which is, ultimately looking at mobilizing capital. It does it purely on a commercial returns basis, but there is, in a sense, like sort of national interest kind of criteria that is in effect, I think, a little bit um, uh, sort of more poignant than potentially others that don't necessarily kind of put that into the mandate. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's a very, so I don't want to overplay, I guess, like all of these pension funds suddenly investing in all of these critical industries. There's absolutely going to be a mixture. There's going to be some testing. There's going to be some looking at different ways to do it to ensure that it's not too high risk. But this comes back to kind of like communication and coordination and actually working almost like more productively with governments and other governments to say, well, how can we kind of leverage that? And one other really quick point is, I didn't touch a lot on export credit agencies and those agencies and obviously different varieties. But again, Australia, US, and Japan have, sort of a really good base of those institutions that are very useful at sort of playing a role in helping to direct traffic and signal sort of the priority areas.
Yeah. So I think this is a perfect transition into kind of our last section, which were your recommendations, which were excellent. Of course, everyone should read them, but I do want to dive into them just a little bit more. So, the first one was lowering cost of capital, but I had a lot of questions about the others. So another one of your recommendations was enabling priority projects. But on what timeline should we kind of expect real cooperation in these areas? You cited all these long lead times before. So when should we be expecting more cooperation? What's present now that can push things hopefully a little bit faster?
Mm. Well, I think just quickly on the lowering cost of capital, like that should never be something that disappears from governments' minds about like what's in their control and ability to look at any mechanism that supports private sector in creating and or investing in manufacturing or supply chain logistics. Like that's just a fundamental um, element that's a really key. On enabling priority projects. One of the key sort of, I think, parts, particularly in energy, that's still really fundamental is that all of these projects need the right environments, usually from a policy and regulatory point of view, to actually become even viable, feasible, and then bankable. And so, in that context, the enabling piece and actually getting that foundation comes down to understanding that policy and regulation is like sort of the key enabler. So, there's lots of different attempts to, and good attempts to actually kind of streamline policy and regulation. There's also in certain markets a need to kind of completely rewrite the policy and regulatory environment. But that kind of enabling priority projects is almost like the precursor to then identifying the projects. And that piece is fundamental because I consistently hear of folks that say, I want to do a deal here. I want to do an investment here. There's actually not enough projects to invest in. So, and or the projects are maybe too small for the investment mandate. So getting that kind of enabling environment is absolutely critical. But the thing about that is that there's like really good lessons across markets on the policy and regulatory environment. Like not every nation should be tackling this kind of by themselves on repeat because it actually takes too long.
Yeah.
So the kind of context
Are you
of
saying
speed.
sharing more,
Yeah.
recommendations for this is how it worked for me and stuff
Yeah.
like that? Okay.
Yeah. Like absolutely. Like that kind of capacity building, sharing information piece, like and make it really high level. Make it something that people want to go to and that has, real cut through.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the bedrock about the enabling environments.
Well, I guess kind of the elephant in the room here is how much of this is dependent, on the current political climate. In the US, we have a president every 4 years. How much of this comes down to just who is in charge at the highest levels of government? And how much of it do you think is more of a sustained effort across government, industry, just the entire landscape? I know that's a very difficult question, but
Well, do you want to? Alrighty. I'm an optimist by nature,
Okay.
so I fundamentally believe that this is all possible. But I do think that a significant tension across democratic nations is exactly that. Our democratic capabilities and the bedrock of a rules-based international order and those that operate at a domestic and international level. Um, but that is also the greatest ability that we have right now to supercharge this kind of coordination across different countries because there will be trust and there will be good governance that's applied to any investments that might not come from others. So that's a really, really key kind of part of it. But ultimately, as I said before, I'm hopeful that there is like a tipping point where, essentially we need things so much in the AI infrastructure boom and that the innovation is such an enabler. And in effect, we just have to really work really hard at continuing to provide the physical inputs that help that, and of course continue to drive technology and innovation forward,
Mhm.
that this actually becomes its own coordinating and functioning mechanism over time. And that actually gets out of a political cycle
Mhm.
because that will be a function that is and an opportunity for our world for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's the kind of key piece of it. I think the other thing is, as I mentioned before, successive administrations have done an extremely good job of looking at how to do this and right size it.
Mhm.
And so, the adage or the old age thing is like build on things as opposed to kind of recreate them. That's I think a critical component for any policymakers to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tim, are you an optimist?
I actually am very much so. So no, I think a lot of what you said resonates with me. I find myself thinking about what you said about the lines of communication. Like, so what are those vehicles? What's that norm look like? How did those take place? Again, because it's going to be the enabler for what's to come, hopefully, and to establish a new norm, I think is kind of what you're talking about. Where it's what we expect, right? Rather than putting in all this work and all that kind of stuff to it. But yes, I'm optimistic too that we'll find our path. Just based on the entrepreneurial spirit of
Mm.
that we're going to find a way, the markets will find a way. It's dynamic, right? There's problems out there to be solved, and there's always somebody around the corner that's looking for an opportunity to solve it because you can win from it, right? There's capital to be to be made from doing so and to grow the whatever enterprise that they have that they're looking at to moving forward.
So I'm going to ask a hard question that I think is very tied to this incentive idea and trust, which was your third recommendation was aggregating demand across allies, which I love. I think I share your optimism, but I'm wondering how this, actually looks in reality, given the dangers of, say the U.S. moved some sort of processing plant to Indonesia. I think, why should the U.S. or Australia or Japan or any country lean on allies to sort of keep some of these critical capabilities offshore, were there to be a war that would break out or, political tides turn? Like how does this trust actually enable these projects to happen and can it happen?
Hmm. I think one of the key pieces here is sort of this concept of we've reshored because we don't want others to have this capability, or in a time of crisis, we don't want to sort of have that exposure and that risk, which is really valid.
Yeah, which is the political, yeah,
Right.
right now.
Yeah, absolutely. But the context of why we set up in certain locations and how we saw that happen, and realistically, so much production and manufacturing has been happening in China is we didn't strategically plan that. That was kind of like a market dynamic that just happened. The difference now is saying, okay, we're here now. What is it that we actually can strategically plan? And I hope governments reached kind of a new era, if you like, of strategic planning,
Mhm.
and looking at that kind of longer term vision. I also think it's timely to try and forecast more. It's a really fraught game in government because you never know, and there's always changes and everything. But I think we can see the through lines here. I think it is possible to see that. So, I think just kind of to that point on what's possible. I want to also turn to that point on like the actual specific aggregating demand piece. Well, actually, a executive board member recently of a very well-known organization that sort of focuses a lot on mining and minerals and others, said to me, the hottest ticket in town right now, Georgie, is government offtake. If I can get like a large like offtake, basically, if government becomes my customer or underwrites a serious amount of demand of something, that's the best thing that can ever happen
Mm-hmm.
because it gives me like the confidence, it gives the board the confidence to go out and do something like that. So if that's the hottest ticket, then what is it that friends and allies can do to make that ticket like really big
Mm-hmm.
and pull together demand? And I think it's a fascinating kind of process of sharing and coordinating information and being okay with that, and also being okay to make some mistakes in forecasting that demand. But it's kind of better than not, because at private sector level, there's not an ability to necessarily kind of, you can shop around a fair amount, but actually like pooling all of that is, I think it's a potential strategic advantage of allies and partners, because we're all kind of sitting in the same needs and requirements and shaping and shooting towards the same vision.
Mm-hmm.
Do you subscribe to the what you just described with the government outtakes?
Oh, I mean, certainly from my own private sector experience,
Yeah.
like that was very real.
Yeah.
That was very true.
Okay.
Yeah, in order for us to be able to build a manufacturing facility, we
Yep.
needed to know that it would last, that what we were producing would actually not just provide something for 5 years, but it would be bought for 20 years. So like 100%. And that the same goes in energy as well.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're trying to actually rewire sort of like energy markets.
Sure.
You need to know that you've got, sort of the energy demand and the market design is there, and governments play a significant role in that.
That was my favorite one. But moving fast into the last three before we get to the Q&A, because I know we have a couple of questions that have come in the chat. So very quickly, another recommendation that you state is building shared financial platforms. So what would that actually, look like in practice? Just what would that look like?
Well, ultimately, I think you have to create a boundary set when you're building a financial vehicle. And that boundary set is actually, this is kind of something that's almost like a term that's evolved over a little while. I think the NATO Innovation Fund is probably a good example of that, where it gets its capital from and then where it invests that capital, and on what basis, based on like the prioritization of certain technologies. But if you apply kind of a boundary set and including, for example, like a theme, I think if we look at AI infrastructure, okay, let's, you do the sort of that mapping exercise of what is required. And there's a whole variety of different sub-funds that could be created. We're already seeing, I think, digital infrastructure being really well funded and de-risked. Other elements of that include everything from electrical and energy cables and that kind of like area, through to obviously the sort of manufacturing components. So if you were to actually sort of look at creating, I think I put in the article like an Indo-Pacific Critical Industries Fund. This could have multiple kind of sub funds and sub pillars within it. And effectively, almost you have a backbone organization, which is a term well known as sort of the innovation ecosystem landscape, to describe something that kind of is the pull through for that learning capability that is really important. Like when a classic venture capital organization invests in a business, one of the things that they do when they invest is they say, we believe in the founders of this business and we're going to provide you ongoing support as you grow your business. And that's a really common kind of element to actually help that investment. So if you apply that logic and you look at that in like a project landscape, or you look at that in a kind of investment landscape for this, that backbone organization can provide that kind of critical support, sort of the support on even white glove policy and permitting, lessons and learnings across countries. So it's not just about the actual investment platform and the kind of fund management side of it, but it's also about actually explaining and articulating on a repeated basis over time the key principles and lessons and learnings of what allies and partners are finding across the governments and their private sectors. And, even like a kind of classic, template, if you like, of like, okay, you want me to invest in this infrastructure. if it's dual use, how much will you use it as a government? How can I right size the actual structuring of the finance deal? Like those sorts of kind of methodologies that need to be sort of used over and over again are really good foreground to look at ways to actually build a platform like this. So that's kind of the grassroots element, I guess, of it. And then sitting over the top of that is very much a kind of opportunity for the strategic coordination across allies and partners and ensuring that those priorities are met for both nations and regions alike.
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple of your last recommendations too, improving government coordination and then accounting for the strategic economic value. I would love to keep talking about them. We're gonna, transition quick to Q&A, but everyone should read that article for an explanation of, what we're talking about.
And the other ones too, not just
Yes,
yours.
all of them.
Definitely. Yeah.
All of them.
Right.
Whole
Yeah.
series.
Yeah.
There will be more.
Yeah.
So our first question comes from Thomas, and he asks, how familiar just is this crew with the joint concept for competing that was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in February 23? And it was developed over a 2-year period with contributions from a variety of different agencies in the US.
Familiar enough, and I think there's some key lessons and learnings from that as well. Are you familiar with that in more detail?
Familiar enough also. What I would say is, so again, in this environment, we need to figure out, I guess, where our strengths are, where our partner strengths are, right? And then, to the earlier question, I mean, this comes practically down to resilience, right? So how can we help each other be resilient in the strengths that we bring to the combined fight, if you will? And so, and that takes work, right? I think to figure that out. You know, not just from the security standpoint, but across the society when you look at your economies and such. So that's when I think of that question, and maybe it's not as detailed as it could be when it comes to the specifics on that, but that's what I think about, right? At least when you first approach it.
Interagency coordination, and then
Right.
how can we get ready for an allied cooperation?
Right, yeah. And again, how do I think about resilient? Where are my gaps and shortfalls, right? And where can I get where can I, with my allies and partners, figure out, ways to fill those out? I think about the E7, for example, right away. That's just something we don't have the technology, right? And obviously something that Australia's been great with, and so in a very real way. So what are those other opportunities too, where you could build resilience, right? And you could move quickly to do it, essentially.
Yeah.
So
We have one last question, which is, can the panelists just quickly address how economic growth and security support each other? And this is from Dave, and he says, a saying in Iraq was, a hand alone does not clap.
Yeah, they're so entwined. I mean, I used to like this term, like strategic economic entanglement. There's just, you can't separate the strategy from where economics kind of is. But I think that if anything, like, they're much more entwined. I think this is kind of a little bit of the point. We've moved from like the battlefield being where we measure success to where the upstream is and how we coordinate the things that help to build the battlefield. And that's really fundamentally part of that. And what sits behind that is kind of the economic growth and economic power and might of a country and capability, and how it can invest into a whole swathe of different activities across innovation, research. It's people. Let's not forget, people are like a huge component into all of this as well as sort of those physical assets that we've talked about. And then, that ultimately is the enabler, and it's a reinforcing loop because, one of the core things we've sort of touched on briefly, but, abundantly aware that obviously we're talking about this kind of multilateral setting, and supply chains being global, and how do you protect those? And will you protect those through security and through our defense? And you actually, we need that. We really need to maintain that strength and that credibility in different regions to ensure that we can do that. So there is kind of that reinforcing loop between those two elements.
The 2025 national security strategy double downs, I guess, on that concept as reinforcing. You have to have, one to have the other, and to continue to grow and to continue to prosper, and that they're reinforcing. It's not a new concept, but I think it's been reinforced in this strategy much more so than it has been in recent history. So to your point, right? So.
I think that's a perfectly summative note to end up off on, because we are just at time. But Georgie and Tim, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
This is great.
Yeah, and so of course everyone should read Georgie's article, and we will be having, I think, seven more articles to go, with Mark Mitchum's article on defense budgets and economic statecraft releasing next. So we will be doing more of these webinars at this channel. And the next webinar is on April 8th at 11 a.m. So you can already register here. So again, Georgie, Tim, thank you guys. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. And well done on the series as well. It's such an impactful piece of work. So I'm just humbled to be part of it.
Thanks for our audience. And we'll see you next time.